Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Black History Conversation. This is the 3rd of March, 2023. And can we say a big shout out to Liz, who is resting in sunny Australia. I don't know what the temperature is, but it's quite warm and it's quite cold in the UK at the moment. My name is Garrick Prayog. I'm located northwest of England, a member of Windrush Allied Network, as well as the Black History Conversation. I have a colleague that also works closely with the work we do, is Sister June Elizabeth. Can you just say a little bit about yourself, Sister June Elizabeth?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Garrett. I'm located, my name's June Elizabeth Watsmith Gully. I'm an international Windrush advocate, advisor, trainer and ambassador. I'm located in Northampton and I've lived in London, and I'm a former retired nurse, health counsellor and teacher. I also am an Advent campaigner for justice for all, especially at this time for the Windrush generation. And I sit on many platforms. On a Sunday, twice a month, I sit on the panel with Justice for Windrush Generation that our host, Garrick and Roland, who's going to join us soon, they run that. And Glenda Caesar and myself, we support the panel by answering the questions and presenting. So that's just a little bit. Excellent. I like music as well.
Yeah, big.
I've just started my MA history, so I'm interested in what you're doing in Nottinghamshire, and the topic is emotions in history. So we're looking at emotions throughout different periods. So I've just started that.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. And so we have a guest speaker, as we always do on this platform. And can I do a warm welcome to Eleanor Shearer, who's going to speak to us about River Sing Me Home. And after Eleanor's presentation, we get the opportunity to ask some questions about the book and the narrative, and then we'll open up to a discussion. So over to you, Eleanor, and welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. So my name is Eleanor Shearer. I'm a writer based in the UK. I'm mixed race. My mum is Afro-Caribbean and my grandparents were part of the Windrush generation. They came to the UK in 1957. River Sing Me Home is my first novel, and it's about a woman, Rachel, in the Caribbean after the abolition of slavery, who's trying to find the children that were taken from her and sold to different plantations. One of the great crimes of slavery was the way that it destroyed people's right to a family life. And we know that there really were women in the Caribbean who refused this act of destruction and went to try and put their families back together again. And Rachel is inspired by that real bravery that we saw in history. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of the themes in the novel, family, memory and freedom. And throughout, I'm going to be threading through some of the research that I did as part of a master's in politics, where I was looking at the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean and the case for reparations, because a lot of the work that I did there, where I was going out and talking to activists, family members, historians in the Caribbean, trying to see how slavery still shapes the islands today. A lot of that research kind of fed into what I wanted to do with this novel and the history that I really wanted to draw out. So River Sing Me Home was inspired, as I said, by the women in the Caribbean who tried to put their families back together again. And I first learned about these women at an exhibition put on by the Windrush Foundation called Making Freedom, that was all about how enslaved people in the Caribbean resisted from small everyday acts of resistance right through to revolutions and rebellions like the Haitian Revolution. And it was part of this exhibition that they mentioned the fact that women went and looked for their children after emancipation. And this struck me as such an incredibly brave thing to do, such a powerful act of resistance, that pretty much as soon as I learned about it, I knew that one day I wanted to write a novel. And I was lucky enough to meet Arthur Torrington, who'd helped put on the exhibition, and spoke to him about these women and how moved I'd been. And he introduced me to an oral history text, which was what the exhibition was drawing on, called To Shoot Hard Labour, which is about the life of a man called Samuel Smith, who was born in Antigua in the 1870s, but because he lived to be 103, he was able to tell his grandchildren in the 1970s about his life story. And he remembers his great-great-grandmother, a woman called Mother Rachel, who walked from the south of Antigua up to the north of the island to try and find her daughter Minty, and was able to successfully reunite with her. So my own protagonist, Rachel, is very much drawing on that story of Mother Rachel. And I think one of the reasons that I was so drawn as well to telling a story about family fragmentation and family reconnection is in my own family, there is still such a theme of this, even right up to this day. My grandparents, as I say, moved to the UK, and particularly my grandfather didn't really speak to his family in Barbados after he came. And to this day, you know, he's passed away now. We don't really know why he did that, but I think there must have been a huge amount of pain there at the separation that led to that kind of fracture. And in my returning to the region and forming new connections there, I've been reminded constantly of the possibility, the hope that you can always rebuild those family links. And I want to just tell a couple of stories that illuminate that. So when I was in St. Lucia, which is where my grandma was from once, something that happens to my protagonist in the novel a few times when she's trying to find her children is that someone will look at her face and say, I think I recognize something in your face. I've seen your daughter before. And I've had some people ask me, you know, does this stretch credulity a bit that someone would do this? But it's something that's happened to me. I was in St. Lucia and I was talking to a man who asked me where I was from and wanted to know about my family. When I told them that they were in Canaries and that their surname was Lansico, he said, yeah, wait there a second. And he went and got his colleague and said, you guys have the same face. I think you must be related. And it turned out that this man, his grandfather, was my grandmother's half brother. And the fact that a complete stranger would be so attuned to my features and so open to the possibility that I might have family still lost in the Caribbean was such a moving experience. And so again, feeds into the novel, the fact that Rachel does receive help from so many characters who are able to see something in her and recognize something in her and help her on that journey to reconnection. But also, as I mentioned, my grandfather's family, we're actually back in touch with them, and particularly my great aunt, his one surviving sister, who turned 90 this year. And I was the first person in my family to visit her back in 2018. And after my visit, my mum said to me, did you find out what her mother's name was? Because my mum didn't even know her own grandmother's name. So kind of total was the silence of my grandfather about his family. And so when we went back to the Caribbean in September, my mum came with me to see Dorothy in Barbados, and we were able to ask her about her mother. And so my mother learnt her grandmother's name for the first time, Leotta, learnt about her life, saw a picture of her, learnt about the way that she looked after all these kind of children in the family. She was a real matriarchal figure. She used to make coconut ices to sell at church fairs, and all the children would pitch in, and all these wonderful stories. And it was a reminder to me that one of the kind of animating drives behind my protagonist, Rachel, is this sense that she has to find out what has happened to her children, and there's no recapturing the lost years. Obviously, these are children that would have been taken away from her when they were children, you know, 10, 11, 12, and she's trying to find them when they're adults. But even if you can just hear stories, even if you can start to piece together the gaps of what happened, that is so meaningful, because I saw how much it moved my mother. Even though she's never going to meet her grandmother, it moved her so greatly to be able to learn about this piece of the family that had been forgotten, and to kind of resurrect that memory of her within our own family lineage. So that power of story and the power of learning the truth about your family members, that was very much something that I wanted to reflect in the novel as well, because it's so close to my own family's heart and our experience of reconnecting with our family in Barbados and in St. Lucia. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about memory, and memory was really core to the research that I was doing about the impact of slavery on the Caribbean. And the reason for this was that the point of my master's was there are many people, myself included, who consider ourselves to be egalitarians in a global sense. We think that the world's economic resources are incredibly unjustly distributed and should be distributed more fairly. However, there are then a subset of those people who would say that's as far as it goes. So effectively, if you woke up tomorrow and had redistributed all of the wealth and the money in the world more fairly, that would completely eliminate any need for reparations. You wouldn't need to engage with the past. You wouldn't need to do anything further. So what I was interested in is trying to explore whether there's a distinct need for reparations on top of that wealth inequality. So I'm someone who absolutely believes in the need for financial redistribution, financial compensation. But what I was specifically looking at is the fact that I think that things like slavery leave their psychic marks on regions like the Caribbean, even to this day. And there's a kind of non-material damage that needs to be addressed, healed, and repaired in ways that might not always involve financial resources. So memory was one of the things that I was looking at. And there was this concept that I came across that was coined by a Jewish American theorist, and it's called post-memory. And this woman, Marianne Hirsch, she describes how her parents had fled the Ukraine in the Second World War. And she had never been to the part of the world that they were from originally, but she went on a visit with them. They were walking around the city that they'd grown up in, and she felt like she had a memory of the place. So vivid was her sense of it, even though she'd never been before. And in particular, the way that post-memory works is it's about what can and cannot be said. It's about the fact that she'd obviously heard stories about this place from her parents, but there were also silences. They'd been through something so traumatic that there were things that they couldn't speak aloud. There were things that they couldn't pass on. And the vividness of her sense of it came from the fact that she was having to imagine into those gaps. So it's the stories and the silences that create this very emotional attachment to the past, emotional attachment to the trauma of what people you love and have been through. And so this also is at work in my novel. I was very deliberate about the fact that I wanted this to be a book not about slavery, but about what comes after it. It's set in 1834. It's set very deliberately in that time because it's a very ambiguous moment. It's when the Emancipation Act had come into force in the British Caribbean, but as many of us know, that didn't really mean freedom. It involved the apprenticeship period where enslaved people had to work without pay on their old plantations for their old masters for another 6 years. So my protagonist, Rachel, has to run away from her plantation to be able to go and look for her children. So set in this ambiguous time in 1834, but the book literally starts with Rachel leaving her plantation because it's about what kind of life can you make for yourself after freedom. But obviously slavery, I didn't want to flinch from the horrors of what my protagonist had been through. So it does cast a shadow over the novel, but often the trauma and the violence is hidden, it's implied. Characters can't speak it aloud, and they have to, with a look, with a touch, be able to form community with others who have been through the same thing. So that theme of what can and cannot be said really runs like a thread throughout this novel. And I finally want to just touch on, under this auspice of memory, the idea of song and music as well, because obviously the title has singing in it, River Sing Me Home, and it's a big theme in the novel because when you're dealing with these fractured, fragmented histories, you know, people being ripped from their ancestral homelands and denied the right to practice their old religions, to speak their old languages. Song is one of the ways in which memories can be passed down. And so it's a common occurrence in the novel that a character will hear someone singing in a language that they don't think that they speak, and suddenly it will trigger something in them and they will realize, you know, I must have heard that song as a child. I don't remember my own mother, but there's something about it that I must have heard it, and it enables me to and take that song on and pass it down to my descendants, and so we can still maintain this sense of our history and still maintain these ancestral memories. And finally, I want to talk about freedom, which I think is one of the biggest themes in the novel. It's a book about what it means to be free, and I think that the exhibition Making Freedom that the Windrush Foundation put on was really inspirational for me. That idea of making freedom, that idea that I think in the UK in particular, we often learn about abolition as this, you know, story of benevolent white people like William Wilberforce freeing the slaves, when in fact that doesn't do any justice to the agency of people in the Caribbean who were fighting every day for their freedom. And so Rachel is looking for her 5 surviving children, and each of them in a different way has chosen to make a life for themselves outside of and after slavery. And each of those reflects something about what it means to be free, but all of those choices are so different. You know, the novel covers everything from armed uprisings, the Demerara Rebellion, which is actually the 200th anniversary of this year, that idea of trying to take freedom by force and taking all the risks that that comes with. But then you have the maroon communities, the runaways, people who just got themselves out of the plantations and then often in areas were mixing with indigenous peoples and building a kind of life for themselves that way. You also have a character who is like me, mixed race, and makes the choice to pass. And so that was a particularly difficult storyline for me to write as someone who is very actively claiming my Caribbean heritage, but I knew that there were people throughout history who have made this choice to kind of deny their ancestry in order to access more privileged spaces. So that is in itself a kind of freedom, even though it definitely comes with very heavy costs. So all throughout the novel, I'm exploring this idea of what it means to be free at this particular time when, you know, the legal category of being enslaved has ended, and yet the system of economic exploitation, the plantation system, still continues. So there's that kind of that hanging over everything as well in terms of what it actually means to be free. And linking it back to reparations, I think that one of the things that has always struck me, both in my research, but also more generally in my life, listening to my grandparents' experiences, my mother's experience of being in this country, is what I call the memory gap between the Caribbean and the UK. The fact that the way that when I spoke to family members in the Caribbean, when my mother and I are speaking about the history of slavery, we know so much about the resistance. We know so much about, it was mentioned earlier in the discussion before this meeting, we know about the compensation offered to slave owners and not to the enslaved. We know about the continued system of exploitation in the Caribbean that doesn't just end with slavery. These were all things that when I went out there and did my fieldwork for my master's, people were telling me time and time again. But it's just not known in this country. You know, when my grandparents came here, people hadn't even heard of the Caribbean, or if they had, they'd only heard of Jamaica, and my grandparents are from St. Lucia and Barbados, and the kind of injustice of the fact that they, you know, my mother is named after 2 English queens. They knew everything about this country and this country knew nothing about them. It's a real animating force for me to want to tell these stories through literature. And one of the things I wanted the book to have is almost this oral history feel to it. It's very much the story of Rachel. It's the story of her quest to find her children. But along the way, she meets so many secondary characters who may only be in the novel for a chapter or 2, but they get that space on the page to tell their stories. And I wanted you to get this sense that it's almost like the tip of an iceberg. You hear fragments of this person's life and then they go away again, and you realize that they are living a life that is as full and rich as my protagonist Rachel's, and you might not ever get to hear all the details of it, but you can understand that there is so much more going on below the surface. So this idea that you're not just encountering one imagined life, Rachel, you're encountering many imagined lives in the novel. So I'll wrap things up there to say that it's a novel about freedom, it's a novel about family, and it's a novel about memory. And yeah, I'm really happy to get the chance to come here and share it with you all.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for that presentation, Eleanor. Just before we sort of raise some question from what you've presented, can I just ask you a question about your own name, Shearer? Do you know the origin of your name?
So that's my father's name. So it's a white British Scottish name. Correct,
Scottish. And most of the Shearers are actually living in Lancashire.
Ah.
If you have a look, you will see there are more Shearers in Lancashire than any other part of the UK.
Really?
And also there's a connection with Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And Jews, and the way the spelling, the dramatic spelling does vary, but Shearer, very big Lancashire resident, historical. I had to look at that because I'm always curious about people's name, because your name will determine, you know, where your origin comes from, and that movement of people. So you know, your name may be completely isolated from a country because, you know, the people were taken from one place to another, and I'm always curious about that. So that's quite interesting. And of course, Alan Shearer is the footballer that's from Newcastle, they say. Yes. Interesting enough, The Guardian did a really good review of your book, because when I got the email from Liz, I knew nothing about this, so I had to quickly try and, you know, find out a little bit more. And you know, I read quite a bit of the review. And of course, you spoke about Barbados, Guyana, and, Rachel as the person, trying to find her children, but not in one place, moving around. And that, in some way, that connect with the whole thing about slavery and how people were disfranchised and lost, and family and were just lost, separated, and that's quite real. That's what happened to many families, separated. And I discover my own family roots, because part of my root is maroon from my grandmother's side of family, but I discover from my father's side of family, who came from India, I've got family in other islands of the Caribbean. And, you can always connect how they actually got to those places and, when they got to those places. Quite interesting. But yes, the novel does sort of bring us into a situation that we can all imagine ourselves and our individual family being effective in this way. And, many people still haven't found their family. Family has gone, and the thing with slavery, you don't have a continuation of families. So, unlike, British family can go back 400, 500, 600 years, we can't do that, because of course, there's a reason why we can't do that, because families were removed, named were changed, language was changed, all that thing. So it's very, very difficult for us to go back 300 years and have that sort of family line. And many people want to do that, but it's not possible. So now is the opportunity for us to really ask some question, what led to you writing this novel? And, you can connect with this because you started off by saying that your family is of mixed heritage. So, again, you're connected into slavery, into that old movement of people. But you also mentioned something about, in the Caribbean, the conversation in the Caribbean is different from the conversation in the UK. So, I just wanted for you to just say something about that, because all of us know that in the Caribbean, in terms of the structure of education, etc., we're predominantly, British, French, bit of Spanish, etc. But we know more about Europe and Europeans, and yet Europeans don't know about us. Can you say something about that? Because you made that point.
Yeah, so I think that this, as you described, the huge asymmetry between what is known and what is recognized, that was part of my research, because I think it is a consequence of, and it is a form of, the ongoing injustice of slavery and colonialism. So I think this fact that people in Britain, particularly after the independence of so many of the former countries of the British Empire, it's almost like this country has washed their hands of them and think, oh, well, it's nothing to do with us anymore. We don't need to know anything about it. And that lack of acknowledgement, I think, is part of the ongoing harm. So when I mentioned earlier about how I think reparations can take multiple forms, not just financial compensation, one of the forms I think has to be addressing this huge historical imbalance and addressing the gap between what's known in the Caribbean and what's known in the UK. But I also think that one of the things that slightly surprised me when I went out to the Caribbean to do my research and was interviewing people out there is that I think there was a big distinction between the people I was speaking to, who I guess you could call historically conscious out there. So the historians, the reparations activists, who did have that very strong sense of, this is the history of resistance in the area. This is why slavery still continues to shape the island today. This is why it's still a form of injustice. And then particularly with some of the older family members that I was talking to, who were less kind of plugged into the reparations movement, a kind of instinctual silence, a kind of shutting down of any attempt to discuss slavery. I would say, you know, do you know anything about that? And they say, no, I don't know anything about that. I don't think about that. Oh, no, I wouldn't know about that. And one of the activists I was speaking to said that he thought it came from a sense almost of shame. He was describing how when he learnt about the history of slavery for the first time when he was about 11, the first emotion was not pain, it was shame. And so this need to, the silence as a form of that ongoing trauma. And so one of the things that I thought was so wonderful about getting to meet these activists in the Caribbean was that there can sometimes, or people sometimes criticize reparations as this idea that it's perpetual victimhood, or that you're constantly locked into this cycle of needing to see yourself as a victim. And that wasn't at all what I found out in the Caribbean, because whilst people were, you know, unequivocal about what they wanted from the UK, it wasn't like they needed our acknowledgement or needed our money to be able to do the work of repair. They're actually out there on the ground at the moment doing work within the community to rebuild that historical consciousness, to rebuild those links to heritage that has been lost, to build links, you know, between the Caribbean and between West Africa, for example, so that you can retain some of that knowledge that has been lost. So whilst there definitely is this gap, I think, between what the UK knows about slavery and what the Caribbean knows, there's also gaps within the Caribbean, and there's this sense of kind of people turning away from the history because it's too painful to look at. And I was so inspired by the historians that I met that were doing this work within their own communities of trying to draw that history out again, because I think it's so important to bear witness to what people went through and to acknowledge what people went through. And one of the quotes, or one of the things that someone said to me that really stayed with me, it was a man in St. Lucia who said to me, I don't think we should be ashamed that it happened. I think we should be proud that we survived it. And that is, you know, a spirit I really keep with me and want to imbue in my own work, because I do think that we should be proud of, like I say, proud of the resistance, proud of the ways that people were able to make lives for themselves, even under these absolutely awful conditions. But there was still love, there was still hope, and there was still joy. And that's very much the point of my novel, is wanting to find the love and the joy and the humanity, even in this incredibly dark period in history.
Yes, and one of the things that Black History Conversation continued to speak about is, you know, how do we get information from these conversations into those audiences? So that may be schools, so that may be further education, so that may be higher education, and society as a whole, you know, getting this information, because, you know, the information exists, but people don't want to even discuss it or be reminded of it. And there's an example, particularly with the Windrush generation. We all understand and we all know that the Windrush generation was invited to come to Britain to rebuild the country. But in 2018, they don't want the Windrush people here. And it's almost now, you know, this continuation of hostile treatment to people of Black and brown skin. We know it's almost like, well, you know, we don't need you anymore. So, you know, sorry, you know, off with you. And we see that continually with, you know, migrants, with refugee, with asylum. Only 2 days ago, I heard in East London, in the middle of the night, that people from the refugee community were pushed out in the street after midnight, right, with nowhere to go. I had a phone call and somebody was describing to me what happened to these people. And the response was they need the accommodation for Ukrainians. Right? This is the reality of what's happening. And it you know, these conversations we're having now, you know, it needs to be taken into those spaces that don't really have these conversations, and we need to ensure that we have a way in to have these conversations. And it shouldn't be just Black people talking about it. I've said this before, you know, it's about everybody having this conversation, because our journey, our history, our stories are interrelated, they're intertwined into everything. And it's important that those conversations, you know, does happen. So you're absolutely, you know, correct about the difference between the conversation that take place in the Caribbean, in Africa, and the conversation take place in the UK. There are different conversations. Mm. And often when you try to have the conversation, it's almost that people don't want to hear that. They don't want it. Yeah, and it makes it quite difficult to engage. They don't want to hear these things. I just wonder now if we could just open up for any question directly to Eleanor in relation to what she has said about the novel, or even the wider conversation about reparation and you know, related matters. Anyone would like to raise a question? Oh, I'm just letting in Bunny from Canada is coming into the call. Welcome, Bunny.
Thank you. I am ready.
Are you well?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So we've just had a presentation from Eleanor Shearer on her novel, which is the title is Sing River Sing Home. And we're just now in the position of asking some question about the novel, and also within her presentation, she spoke a little bit about reparation. So this is the opportunity now for questions. So the first question is from Sister June Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, and Eleanor. And I just wanted to ask you, you know, when you done your field research, was there any difference in the different islands or the countrymen that of colour that you could pick up? I asked that question because as a Black history researcher, I had asked when I realised in England that even though, you know, I'd go and socialise with Black people at different areas, I was born here, I realised that they seem to keep to themselves. And I said to this Jamaican, well, why is that? And he said, they're small islands. So I said, so what does that mean? And then why is there that difference? I understand smaller islands, but to me, being born here, I didn't think of anybody coming from different islands. I'm so glad to see people of the same colour as me. And he said, well, I don't know if this is true, but he said, when the Caribbean decided, they had a meeting to have a University of the West Indies, it was supposed to be in Trinidad. But when it was agreed that the University of the West Indies will be in Trinidad, all of a sudden it was built in Jamaica. So that's one reason, he said. So I just want to ask you a question. Did you find, you know, there was a cohesion? Did they interact with each other?
I think that's such a great question. And I think one of the reasons it's hard for me to answer is because I was talking to quite different groups of people in each of the places that I went. So for example, when I was in Barbados, I went there because I wanted to go to the university. So I spoke to quite a lot of historians in Barbados, whereas in St. Lucia, I was speaking more to my own family. So it felt like the people I spoke to in Barbados were more historically conscious, but I don't think that's true. I think I just spoke to more of the kind of activists out there and everything. But I definitely do think that there can be this sense of difference between the islands, but it's almost like you were describing the experience of, you know, I don't think my grandparents, for example, would have thought of themselves particularly as Black before they came to the UK. And one of the activists I spoke to in St. Lucia was saying that he felt like he only developed a sense of his racial politics when he went to America. And it's almost like you have to go to get that sense of cohesion and get that sense of being able to develop a relationship. But I think a lot of the activists that I spoke to were doing a really good job of reflecting the difference between the islands. So, you know, St. Lucia and Barbados, for example, one of them much less densely settled, changed hands a lot between the British and the French, or I think it was 14 times or something. So it has this very mixed, you know, St. Lucia and Creole is largely French, but then Barbados is, you know, was Little England, and so has this very different culture and character. So you have to reflect the differences between the places. But I think reparations activists and the kind of, I guess, Black diaspora more generally, because they're in conversation with people in West Africa, they're in conversation with people in the United States. It's about being able to find the points of commonality and find the solidarity. So I think there really were people doing that work of kind of joining together and seeing the things that people have in common. But yeah, they are very different islands. And certainly, you know, I've heard people have particular stereotypes of some of the islands that aren't particularly charitable. So there's always going to be those differences, but it's nice to know that there are people that are trying to do that work to build the solidarity.
Lovely. Thank you very, very much. I think what we're doing here
good point that Sister June Elizabeth
globally networks. Thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah. That point that June Elizabeth just mentioned in relation to small island. I mean, when you look at the physical island, so Cuba is the largest, we know that. And then if you go by size, you know, and start to look at island by size, you know, the expression small island is almost as if, you know, Jamaica think they're the biggest island in the Caribbean, you know, and they're not, you know. However, you know, sometimes it's your reputation that is big. You know, it's like you're known, you know, so that's the big thing rather than the physical island itself. And, you know, it may be that because of the history of the island, why, you know, that sort of label is there. But, you know, that's an interesting point. Can I just welcome Dr. Wilson McDonnell? And can you just tell us where you're calling in from, please?
Yes, I'm calling from Poland, where I've been for 10 years. I'm a barrister, lawyer, and a chartered accountant, a bit of an academic, but a lawyer in 6 countries. And I'm in Poland at the moment, but I'm attached to the Caymans and the BVI, where I have an active law practice. And for the last 2 years, what I've been doing, and recently I've connected with 2 PhD students at University of London. I attended London University. I interacted with the slave registry. They have something there. And then Cornell, Fordham, Sorbonne, and then a little bit of Oxford and postdoc work. But my work has been in financial derivatives. But in the last 2 years, with the work I'm doing with Black history, I really can't get enough of it, because I've read all the books with the Negro rulers of Scotland. I've read David McRitchie's book on ancient Britons, and Miranda Kaufman at Oxford published a book on the Black Tudors. It took Oxford 1,000 years to realize there are Black people in the UK. What it is, and based on my own 8 levels of testing and DNA, and I manage 50 DNA kits, my family tree is around 540,000 members. So I put and invested a lot of time in the research and trying to pin down what it is, because when I got the results, my DNA did not say that it was haplo-EU's African. Anyone who is a genealogy buff would know that the DNA groups are by letters and it's not in order. E is the old and E is supposed arguably the oldest. And my E was dated 900 years and pinged in Orkney, Scotland. So it got me to, the whole conversation started from there. And I've posed some very difficult questions to the DNA companies. I know it's an imprecise science. I know that it's evolving, but I am a mixed race. I'm 10% Celtic. A couple companies have sought to take away the Celtic and replace it with Indian ethnicity, which I find to be objectionable, very just absurd, because my mom would become 120% Indian. She's full Indian, 98% to be precise, 2% Slavic. And then my dad is 20% Celtic, 80%. He is African, but then it's mixed, Egyptian and Jewish. And
Okay, just pause a moment. So thank you very much for that introduction. And let me just bring us back to Eleanor Shearer's novel, which we're discussing now. It's about River Sing Me Home. And she just presented to us, and we've just been sort of raising some question in relation to her novel and in relation to the period around about emancipation period, and also reparation came into our presentation. We've just been asking any question to Eleanor about that, and she's clearly identified herself as mixed race, dual heritage, etc. And one of the points she made, the fact that the conversation you have in the Caribbean is different from the conversation you have in the UK. You know, and we accept that those differences. Sister, I'm sorry, Dr. Bunik, are you able to raise any point about the novel?
Unfortunately, I haven't read the novel and I missed the presentation.
Okay.
I'm gonna try and find it online
Okay.
as soon as this is
Not
over.
a problem.
But I'd just like to say I'm happy that there's a lot more work like this, you know, coming out during this period. I'm actually reading a novel right now by Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm just happy about all the attention that is being paid to linking histories, you know, to fictional stories and linking them to the situation, the global situation of people of color all over the world right now. So I'm excited to know about her poems, and I'm going to try and get it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Simon, can I just take your point, please, before I welcome Roland?
Yeah, it was just to, because you mentioned about the links between the Caribbean and West Africa, and I put a comment in the chat. I always recommend to people, if you get a chance to go to Benin, there is something called the Porte du Retour, which is the gate of return. And it's an acknowledgement of the role of what was the Dahomey Kingdom in slavery, but it's a welcome back for people from the Caribbean. There are particularly close links with Haiti, and the singer Angelique Kidjo. I don't know if you've come across her. She brings a lot of Caribbean and Latin music into her African roots about that. So it's a very moving place. It's there is they still have some of the slave pens. There's an opportunity to walk down the routes they used to take to the beach, where they used to turn around to a tree of memory, they called it, to try and leave their memories behind, because they didn't want to carry the trauma. And you also mentioned trauma, so I think that's really interesting as another point. So yeah, just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you. And I guess, you know, that's quite emotive, because I have spoken to people who have been, you know, been to Ghana, and the whole journey has been, you know, quite an emotional thing, just to be there and sort of, you know, in that space and sort of start looking back, you know, 200 years or so, and it's almost as if you feel as if you've been transfer into, back in time, just the place itself, and whether that is the ancestors or the spirit, that feeling. People tell me, I've not been, but people tell me they get that feeling, that they just can't explain it. It is so real.
Yeah, it is a very emotional place.
Roland has just joined us. So welcome, Roland. We've just been discussing points from Eleanor Shearer's book, the novel, River Sing Me Home. And just for the benefit of Dr. Buni, the Guardian newspaper did do a really good review of the book, but also on YouTube, you can see the American side, some interview about the book that sort of give an insight as to the writer and the novel. So that's out there in the public domain.
Thank you.
And just to say that Dr. Buni, she actually resides in Canada.
Really?
You're still in Canada, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
I live in Canada.
Yes, still reside in Canada. And can you just say about your Sankofa? Just let people know what Sankofa is.
Oh, okay. Sankofa Pan-African series is a YouTube channel that I started during the lockdown, and what we just try to do is go back on share Pan-African history, and also interview people on like you, for instance, who have written important books, new books, and there are also people who have ideas about how to move a lot of the issues that are affecting the global African, various global African communities. It's yeah, in a nutshell, that's what it is.
Excellent. And also, if you want to find further information, Dr. Buni, just go into YouTube and just type in Sankofa stories. You'll find a lot more information there, and the various publication and recording is there. So that's another resource, to be used and shared around people. We also just joined, Roland has just joined us. Can we just say a quick hello to Roland Oislin?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yes.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm preparing the next, Garrick, so okay. I'm listening.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. So just going back to Eleanor's novel and the story, and
polarized politics.
Sorry, yeah. Can I just ask, in terms of how do you see this novel in relation to the wider Black history conversation, not on this platform, but out in the public domain? How do you see, this novel, maybe as a conversation starter, for example, in different places?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And actually, having just come back from the US, one of the things that's been really interesting is seeing how the reception of the book in America has felt different from the UK, and thinking through why that might be. And I think that one of the things in the UK that has been good in some ways, because I want many people to be able to relate to the book, as you alluded to earlier. I think it's important these conversations go far and wide, and they shouldn't just be within our own communities. But sometimes when people describe the book and say, what a wonderful universal story, who can't relate to a mother searching for her children, there's a risk that we lose the particularity of it. It's not a universal story, it's a story that's situated at a particular place in time. And I don't want people to just be relating to a mother and her children. I want them to be learning about this time in Caribbean history. So sometimes in the UK, I think there's a kind of rush to overgeneralize or fail to see the parts of the book that I want to be kind of radical or challenging or unsettling, because I want people to be fully reflecting on that history. And in America, I think there's it was wonderful to hear about, someone mentioned the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the recent novels there. I think there's this wonderful rich heritage in the US of this literature about the connections between different populations, whether that's something like Yag Yatsi, who's written Homegoing, the novel about these two sisters and their descendants who get separated. One ends up staying in West Africa and the other ends up in the United States. And so this sense of building more of a diaspora and a conversation. And so one of the things I found very energizing about going to the UK is having those conversations with African Americans who in some ways have a very different history of enslavement. And a lot of them have commented to me about how much they appreciated getting the chance to learn about Caribbean slavery, which has similarities with slavery in the American South, but it has differences. You know, one of the things I wanted to draw out in the novel is the fact that the geography of the Caribbean can become part of the confinement. You know, I'm not at all saying it was easy to escape enslavement in the south of the US, but there was always this hope and dream of the northern route to freedom, the idea that you might be able to walk and walk and then you become free, or you could walk and walk and you'd find your family. Whereas at the start of my novel, when my protagonist Rachel is running away from her plantation in Barbados, she very quickly reaches the end of the island and there's no further that she can go without crossing the ocean. So that sense that the islands themselves become part of what's trapping you and separating you from your family. So it's been wonderful to have that conversation in America and be able to tease apart those kind of similarities and disparate differences between different parts of the diaspora. But I think what I really want the novel to do in the UK, you mentioned earlier about, you know, how can we break out these conversations? How can we make sure that more people are aware of these histories? I do think that kind of literature, story, film, TV, storytelling in whatever form has a big role to play, because I think that it can really, at its best, engage people's empathy. I feel like I owe a huge debt to Andrea Levy, the author of Small Island and The Long Song, who I think just did a wonderful job of, you know, telling these stories about Black history, not being afraid to show the more difficult side of things. But I think what I love about her work is that it has such a human heart and a human center to it. So I think people leave feeling, you know, challenged and confronted with some of the worst injustices of the past, but they also don't leave feeling hopeless or dejected. They leave feeling like they can, you know, have some power to change things and make things better. So yeah, that was a slightly long answer, but I think that I've been interested by how the reception in the US and the UK has felt different. And in the UK, I just really want to drive through this sense of this is a particular story telling a particular history, but I really don't want, you know, people who aren't from the Caribbean to be afraid of picking the book up or afraid that they won't be able to connect to it, because I did want it to be about something, you know, all fiction is an exercise in empathy. I myself am, you know, a very fair-skinned mixed race woman in her 20s who does not have children, and my protagonist is a visibly Black woman in her 40s with 5 children. So I had to exercise my own powers of empathy and imagination to get into the character of Rachel. And so I hope that others can do the same when they read her, whatever their race, whatever their heritage.
That's a very good point. And there's another thing for consideration in relation to dual heritage or mixed race audience. And, you know, often when we focus around Black history, sometimes the mixed race don't really see themselves in that history. It's almost that, you know, the separation, and part of that could be the fact that, you know, the mother and father didn't really you know, share that history with their children. It was one-sided or no-sided at all. So particularly in the UK, where dual heritage mixed race is the fastest growing population. So we have cities like Bristol, and studies has been done on this. So Bristol and Liverpool is the 2 largest city in the UK with dual heritage you know, population. And you know, this novel can actually enter those spaces as well as the other spaces that considered to be Black. So, has that been your experience in relation to any dual heritage? When you're having conversation about, whether it's this novel or anything else, do you find that is a different conversation to be had?
I think that's a great question. I think that it probably helps me to be aware. So this book was very much, it has been a journey for me and for my whole family, actually. I think it's many people can probably relate to the sort of generations that come after immigration, and how my grandparents, when they came from the Caribbean, for them assimilation was the goal, and they didn't see anything valuable in what they brought with them. They just really wanted to become English. And I think my mother internalized a lot of those feelings, and so felt like she really had to just, be more English than the English. That was the only way that she was going to get ahead. And it's only my generation, me and my sister, that almost have the comfort and the security in our British identity to turn around and say, no, we are really interested in our Caribbean heritage. We do want to celebrate it. We think it's possible to celebrate it and also be British. And so there's been that sense of, as a mixed race person, how I connect with my roots through staying attached to these family stories. But I think on the other side, because I am also, half white, I have grown up with family members having to have those conversations within my own family of, what are the histories that are known and unknown. I think one of the most egregious examples of this was my dad was doing research into his family and found a branch that had been taken to Australia. And he actually managed to find a church. They were in a stained glass window of a church in a town in Australia. And he was so excited, and he printed off this photo of the stained glass and he took it to my mum. And my mum said, have you not noticed that there are Aboriginal people in chains kneeling at their feet? And he genuinely had not seen. It was, a real, it's quite on the nose, but it kind of shows the way that we see the world, and literally the kind of blinkered way, because all he'd seen were the faces of his ancestors, and he hadn't seen these first Australians literally in chains at their feet. But that's an example of, that those are the conversations happening in my own home, because my home is like an ongoing site of these of race relations and having to navigate these things. And how can you, when you love someone, they do something like that, how can you patiently, lovingly but firmly educate them and make it into a teachable moment? So I guess that my mixed race heritage, when it comes to this book, and how I can use it to, as you say, have conversations in mixed race spaces, it probably does help me to have come from a background where I'm having those conversations all the time within my own family and navigating things.
Yeah, and really to give testimony to what you've just said, we all know about the Black Lives Matter, and what we've seen. For the very first time in that movement, we saw people of all ages, all colors, all races, coming together and saying, Black lives do matter. It does matter, and that's quite different from what we've seen in the civil rights movement and all the other stuff in the United States, for example. So is that telling us something that, in 2023, things are changing? Are we moving to a more inclusive, inclusive society that way, but yet institutionalized? There are still major issues where people on a day-to-day basis are still finding these, these barriers that's been put there specifically to prevent people from getting ahead. Mm-hmm. Almost like a contradiction.
Yeah.
We just got a couple of minutes before we conclude. Is there any other question would like to pose to our guest speaker, Eleanor, before we conclude? We're going to finish around 2 o'clock because some of us have got another meeting at 2:15, so we've got to prepare for that. Dr. Wilton?
Yeah, yes. I just wanted to say really briefly, I've shared some notes, and I encourage people to visit Twitter And it's sad. I mean, you look at it, I have soaked up, and I've been good at soaking up information. I mean, I finished really 3 degrees when I was 18. I'm massively, and no TV was in the house. But that's what I'm good at with the degrees, the 7, 8 degrees that I have. I even lost, I mean, this is quite a lot of work that I've done academically, but not in this space. But I'm a quick learner, quick study. But Dr. Jeanson, a scientist, has come out to say that from a scientific point of view, the young Earth theory, the male DNA mutations occurred in the last 5,000-6,000 years. And what I'm trying to do is I would love to, and I will continue to use my time and talents to push this forward. It's not about Black Muslims or extremists. We sound like, oh, well, this was crazy. The world was black. It was very much black world. And I wouldn't doubt it if the 4 founding fathers, Glenn Beck from the US, got fired. His show was canceled when he suggested a Black founding fathers. George Washington describes the Huguenot and swarthy. And this cover-up with whitewashing, this is not something to fly. And anyone could look at my CV and say that I have all my marbles. I'm 47 years old. I'm just getting started, but we need to push this conversation forward. It affects assets, real estate, the Windrush generation. What's the connection with even Cromwell? And Cromwell deported and killed Blacks. It's so much that went on in the 15 and 1600s to create this narrative. It easily done with different powerful groups, but the scientific discoveries are just paving the way. We need to do more with pushing the conversation, because you know what, it helps to define us. It helps. I mean, these talk about reparations, about where we go. The Barbados prime minister was talking because she was saying, well, why your country can't do more? Why are you borrowing money? Well, that's good to say after you've taken wealth and extracted from my country, but I shared the feed, and she is not backing down. Smart lady, she's on the point. You've basically extracted the wealth and continue to do so in Africa and other countries to laud yourself up with the billionaires that are in your country with the posh lifestyle. But you know what? With a derivatives background, my PhD is in derivatives, it's all coming to an head. And there should not be one single race. I'm 3 races in one. I'm married to a Polish woman. She's white, 100% Celtic. It shouldn't, and I'm not about putting one down, but we continue to live in a model where there's really whites that are superior, and even if it's not said, it's a high level of discrimination which continues. As far as Blacks being down, they burnt down the Black Wall Street. Blacks, of course, pay 2-3 times as much as everyone else. They, of course, get taxed even most because the other tax breaks are available for the very rich. It's not fair, but we're going into a certain paradigm shift economically where we're facing mega crash. We're basically gambling with about 5 to 6 quadrillion, 6,000 trillion of derivatives, and we only have about 80 trillion of GDP. So in this new world, whatever they keep talking about a new world order, we need all persons, as I say, all persons are equal at the foot of the cross. We need the level playing field, and we'll start by having an honest discussion about our history, not just taking away the books of Tacitus. For God's sake, half of his books are missing. He was born in AD 50. He described the Black Celts.
Excuse me, sorry to disturb you, Wooten.
Yes, I know we've got to
close. I've got to leave now.
Yes,
we've got another.
So,
we need to thank the presenter.
Sure.
Which Garrick will do now. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll see you in a minute. So can I just, on behalf of everyone, just thank Eleanor Shearer for her presentation on her novel, River Sing Me Home. And we look forward to further conversation in the future. And can I also thank everyone that actually came on the call today. We have to stop the recording now. Simon, if you don't mind, please.